The most powerful lord in the 5 territories offered her gold, lands, titles, anything she wanted, and told her to name her price. Instead, she unclasped the chain at her throat and set her mother's wedding ring on the table. All her life, other people had set her price. Her parents had seen a quiet, unmarriageable daughter. Her master, Mr. Finch, signed his own name to the maps she painted and treated her as an interchangeable pair of hands. Ochre and verdigris worked permanently into her skin, her opinion never once asked. But Linnea saw what others could not. A lifetime of giving life to color had taught her to feel when something was dying from the inside. And the Lord's great map was not merely faded. It was going out, its life draining away like a wound. So when he asked her to put a price on her gift, she understood what none of the treasures in that room could buy. He was trying to on her gift. She understood what none of the treasures in that room could buy. He was trying to purchase her gift. She understood what none of the treasures in that room could buy. He was trying to purchase the one part of herself that had always been hers. She did not name a price. She gave him one. She set her mother's ring on the polished wood and told him to match its worth. And the Lord who measured value in kingdoms and centuries, a being whose heart had been frozen for 1,000 years, did the one thing no one in the 5 territories had ever seen him do. If you believe that some things can never be bought, type worth below, and let me tell you what happened next. To understand how she got there, you need to know that Linnea's world had always been one of margins and edges. She lived in the spaces others overlooked. As an assistant to the Royal Cartographer, Mr. Finch, her life was a study in being invisible. She was the one who ground the malachite into a perfect, luminous green, who sourced the rare cochineal for a crimson that seemed to breathe, who could boil oak galls into an ink so black it looked like a hole in the page. Her hands created the beauty, but Mr. Finch's name was the one signed at the bottom of every map. He was a man of puffed-up importance and mediocre talent, who saw her not as an artist, but as a useful pair of hands, as interchangeable as his brushes. The wound of it had long ago scabbed over into a quiet resignation. She did the work because she loved the work. She loved the feel of the heavy rag paper, the scent of linseed oil and gum arabic, the magic of bringing a landscape to life with nothing but pigment and water. The summons had come on a Tuesday, a sealed message bearing the obsidian wolf crest of Lord Alaric. Mr. Finch was requested at Blackwood Manor, immediately. The matter was of the utmost urgency, and of course he would require his assistant. Linnea packed her pigment boxes, her brushes wrapped in oilcloth, and her smallest grinding stone, her heart a nervous bird in her ribs. Everyone knew of Blackwood Manor. It sat high in the crags overlooking the valley, a fortress of black granite and sharp towers that clawed at the sky. It was a place of legend and fear. They said the fires within never gave off any real warmth. They said the lord of the manor had not aged a day in the memory of the oldest grandmothers in the village. They said shadows in Blackwood had a life of their own. The journey there did little to dispel the rumors. The air grew colder as the carriage climbed, the pines thick and silent, swallowing the sound of the wheels on the gravel. The manor itself was a masterpiece of Gothic dread, all sharp angles and unnerving symmetry. As they were led through the great doors, a wave of profound cold washed over Linnea, a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. It was a cold that felt ancient, a cold from the heart of a tomb. Lord Alaric was waiting for them in the grand library. The room was a cathedral of books, shelves soaring 3 stories high into a vaulted, shadowed ceiling. A fire roared in a hearth large enough to roast an ox, but its light seemed to be devoured by the darkness just beyond its reach. Candles flickered everywhere, their flames dancing and dipping as if in a constant, unfelt wind. And in the center of it all, standing before a massive oak table, was him. He was impossibly tall, dressed in severe black, his face a study in aristocratic beauty that was too perfect, too still, to be entirely human. His hair was the color of a raven's wing, and his eyes were dark, but as he turned them towards Mr. Finch, a flicker of deep crimson flared within them for just a heartbeat. Linnea felt a tremor of primal fear, a warning passed down through generations. Mr. Finch, oblivious, puffed out his chest. "Lord Alaric, I am here as you commanded. Finch, at your service." Lord Alaric did not offer a greeting. His voice, when he spoke, was like smoke and old wine, a low baritone that resonated in the bones. "The maps, Mr. Finch." He gestured to the table. Laid out upon it was a magnificent, sprawling map of the territories, larger and more detailed than any Linnea had ever seen. But it was wrong. The colors were faded, leached out, as if by a sickness. The vibrant greens of the forests were a pale, dusty sage. The brilliant blues of the rivers were a milky, clouded gray. The entire map looked like a ghost of itself. "This is the atlas of my domain," Lord Alaric said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "It is failing. The colors are dying. No artisan has been able to identify the cause, let alone halt the decay. You are reputed to be the best. Explain this." Mr. Finch scurried forward, peering at the map through his spectacles. He touched the paper, sniffed it, and made a series of important-sounding hums. Linnea stayed back, by the door, her pigment case clutched in her hands. She could feel the wrongness from across the room. It wasn't just faded color. It was something deeper. The very life of the ink was gone. "Ah, yes," Finch declared after a moment, straightening up. "A simple matter of inferior pigment, my lord, compounded by damp. The original artist likely used cheap materials. We shall need to scrape it all down, reprime the vellum, and start again. A lengthy process, but straightforward." Linnea felt her hands clench. Scrape it down? The line work alone was a masterpiece of a forgotten age. To destroy it would be a sacrilege. And he was wrong. This was not damp. This was not poor material. This was something else entirely. She could feel it. The pigments were not fading. They were starving. Lord Alaric's stillness intensified. The temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. The shadows pooling in the corners of the library seemed to deepen, to lean inward. "You are certain," the Lord stated. It was not a question. "Absolutely," Finch boomed, basking in what he perceived as a successful diagnosis. "I shall have my assistant begin preparing the scraping tools at once." He gestured dismissively towards Linnea, not even bothering to look at her. And that was when it happened. A lifetime of being dismissed, of having her work misattributed, of her knowledge being ignored, coalesced into a single, sharp point of courage. The words left her lips before she had even decided to speak them. "He is wrong." The sound was small in the vast, echoing library, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. Mr. Finch froze, his face a comical mask of shock and outrage. The great hall fell so silent you could hear a candle flame gutter. And Lord Alaric, who had not moved a muscle, slowly turned his head. His gaze fell upon Linnea for the first time. It was like being pinned by two shards of polished jet. The crimson flickered again, brighter this time, like embers stirred in a deep forge. "What did you say?" His voice was dangerously soft. Linnea's heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break. Every instinct screamed at her to apologize, to shrink back into the invisibility she knew so well. But looking at the dying map, at the desecration Finch was proposing, she found a strength she didn't know she possessed. She took a hesitant step forward, then another, until she was standing beside the table. She didn't look at her master. She looked at the map. "He is wrong," she repeated, her voice clearer now, steadier. "It is not the damp, and the pigments were of the highest quality. Lapis lazuli for the blues, ground with pure gum arabic, malachite for the greens. The problem is not the material. The problem is the paper. It is no longer feeding the ink." She reached out, her fingers hovering just over the surface. She could feel a profound emptiness from it, a void where there should have been life. Finch finally found his voice, sputtering with indignation. "Nonsense! The girl is a colorist, my lord. She knows nothing of vellum science. Linnea, you will be silent." But Lord Alaric did not look at Finch. His gaze was locked on Linnea. On her face, a light with a passion for her craft that he had not seen in centuries. On her hands, stained with the colors of the earth. On her eyes, which saw not just faded pigment, but a deeper truth. He took a slow step towards her, his movements unnervingly fluid, silent. He stopped on the other side of the table, his crimson-flecked eyes searching hers. "You are the colorist," he stated. "I am," she whispered. "You mix the inks that this man uses." "Yes." "Then the life in his maps comes from you." It was not a question. It was a realization. Linnea could only nod, her throat tight. Mr. Finch began to protest again, a string of blustering complaints about insolence and protocol. Lord Alaric raised a single hand, and Finch's words choked in his throat, as if a fist had closed around his windpipe. The Lord's attention remained entirely on Linnea. "You will stay," he commanded, the words an unbreakable edict. "You will restore this map." Then he turned his gaze, cold and sharp as splintered ice, upon Mr. Finch. "You will leave, now, and you will not take credit for another's work again. Your royal appointment is terminated." The shock on Finch's face was absolute. Ruin, swift and total, delivered in a single, calm sentence. He opened and closed his mouth, but no sound came out. Two household guards, who seemed to materialize from the shadows themselves, appeared at his elbows and firmly escorted the sputtering man from the library. The great doors boomed shut behind him, the sound echoing the end of Linnea's old life. She was alone in a legendary, feared manor, with a man who was clearly not a man at all. He was something older, colder, and far more powerful. He had just destroyed her master and claimed her as if she were a piece of property. Terror, sharp and cold, finally pierced through her professional focus. She stood frozen, her pigment case still clutched in her hand like a shield. Lord Alaric moved around the table until he was standing before her. The chill radiating from him was intense, a palpable aura of winter. She had to tilt her head back to look up at him. His face, seen this close, was unnervingly beautiful, like a statue carved by a master who knew nothing of human imperfection. "You are not afraid of me," he observed, his voice a low murmur. Linnea swallowed. "I am terrified," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "But I am more afraid of what will happen to this map if it is not cared for properly. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his dark eyes. It wasn't amusement. It was something closer to curiosity. An ancient, predatory curiosity. "The map is more than paper," he said, his gaze shifting back to the table. "It is a living record, a covenant. As it fades, so does my hold over these lands, my strength. It is a curse laid upon my ancestor, and it has reached its final, fatal stage." The truth of it settled over her, heavy and cold. This wasn't a restoration project. It was an exorcism, a healing. He was dying in his own way, and he believed she was the only one who could save him. "Why me?" she breathed. "Because you saw," he said simply, turning his piercing gaze back to her. "In a room full of fools and sycophants, you saw the truth. You did not see faded ink. You saw a life draining away. That is a perception no amount of training can grant. It is innate." He paused, the silence stretching, thick with the scent of old books and melting wax. "I have had the greatest minds of the age in this room. Scholars, alchemists, mystics. They all saw what Finch saw, a problem to be scraped away. You saw a life to be saved." He gestured around the vast, opulent library. "I will give you anything you desire. Wealth, property, titles. Name your price for this work." Linnea looked from his ancient, powerful face to the treasures that filled the room. Gold-leafed books, jeweled artifacts, priceless tapestries. None of it meant anything to her. Her world was one of pigment and paper, of quiet work, and the satisfaction of a perfect line. The things he offered were for a life she didn't understand and didn't want. A wave of weariness washed over her. All her life, her value had been dictated by others. First by her parents, who saw her as a quiet, unmarriageable daughter. Then by Finch, who saw her as a tool. Now this ancient lord was trying to purchase her skill, to put a price on the one part of herself that had always been truly hers. And in that moment, she wanted none of it. She wanted recognition, not reward. Slowly, she reached up and unclasped the thin silver chain around her neck. From it hung a simple, worn gold band, her mother's wedding ring. It was all she had left of her, the only object of true value she had ever possessed. She didn't offer it to him. Instead, she stepped to the small, polished table beside the hearth, where a single cup of dark wine sat untouched. With a hand that was surprisingly steady, she laid the ring upon the polished wood. The small, dull gleam of the gold was a stark contrast to the Gothic splendor surrounding it. She turned back to face him. "I do not want your gold or your titles, my lord," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "This ring is the most valuable thing I own. It is my mother's love, my past, the only proof I have that I came from somewhere that mattered." She took a breath, meeting his crimson-flecked gaze without flinching. "You ask me to name my price. I cannot, but you can. If my work, if my sight, is as valuable as you claim, then show me what it is worth. Match the value of this ring." She wasn't asking for treasure. She was asking for understanding. For him, a creature of immense power and immortal cold, to comprehend the worth of a simple, sentimental thing, it was an impossible challenge. A test. Lord Alaric stood perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the small, worn ring on the table. The silence in the room became absolute, heavier than stone. The candle flames froze, their wicks burning without a flicker. The shadows ceased their restless movement. It was as if the entire manor was holding its breath. He looked from the ring to her face, and for the first time, she saw something other than cold authority in his expression. It was a profound, ancient confusion. He, who could measure value in kingdoms and centuries, was being asked to weigh the worth of a memory. He moved towards the table. Linnea's heart pounded. She expected him to laugh, to dismiss it, to sweep the ring aside. She expected anger or contempt. He stopped before the table. He looked down at the simple gold band. Then he looked at the untouched cup of wine beside it. Slowly, as if moving through water, he reached out and picked up the cup. He did not drink. He simply held it. His long, pale fingers wrapped around the silver stem. And then he did something that shattered Linnea's understanding of power. He set the cup down. And he knelt. Not in supplication. Not in defeat. He went down on one knee before the table, before the ring, his head bowed. It was an act of immense, shocking reverence. A king acknowledging a power he did not possess. The power of mortal love, of memory, of a heart that could invest its entire worth in something so small and fragile. He did not touch the ring. He simply knelt before it. A dark, silent king paying homage to a power greater than his own. After a long moment, he raised his head, his eyes meeting Linnea's. The crimson was gone, replaced by a deep, fathomless darkness that held a new light within it. A light of respect. "I cannot match its worth," he said, his voice a low, raw whisper. "No one could. I can only protect it." He rose to his feet, his grace as fluid as ever, but something in his posture had changed. The icy distance had fractured. "The work is yours to command, Mistress Linnea. The resources of this house are yours, not as payment, but as tools for your art. Begin when you are ready." He turned and walked towards the towering shelves, melting back into the shadows from whence he came, leaving her standing in the wavering candlelight, her world irrevocably altered. She had offered her heart's greatest treasure as a challenge, and the Vampire King had answered not with power, but with humility. Would you have had the courage to make such a bargain, knowing who and what he was? Tell me in the comments, and if you are not subscribed yet, join this family. The days that followed settled into a strange, quiet rhythm. Linnea was given rooms in the West Wing, a suite of chambers that were opulent but lonely, the silk bedsheets always feeling unnervingly cold. A silent, gray-haired woman named Elspeth brought her meals and tended to the fireplaces, her movements as quiet and unobtrusive as a moth's. But Linnea spent nearly all her waking hours in the library. It became her sanctuary, her workshop, her entire world. She set up her station near the great windows that overlooked the desolate, beautiful moors. She ground her pigments, mixed her binders, and began the painstaking work of trying to understand the sickness that afflicted the great map. Lord Alaric was a constant, silent presence. He would not disturb her, but she would look up from her work to find him standing in the shadows between the shelves, watching her. Or she would feel a sudden drop in temperature and know he was seated in the high-backed chair by the fire, a book open in his lap, though she never saw him turn a page. His stillness was unnerving at first. It was the stillness of a predator, absolute and watchful. But as the days turned into a week, and then 2, she began to find a strange comfort in it. It was a steady presence in the vast, lonely silence of the manor. She discovered he was right. The paper itself was dead. When she touched a drop of her most vibrant, carefully prepared ink to its surface. The color would flare for a moment and then simply sink, leaving a dull, lifeless stain. It was like trying to plant a flower in sand. One evening, frustrated and weary, she leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. "It's no good," she said, not realizing she'd spoken aloud. "The vellum won't accept the color. It's as if it has no soul." From the deepest shadows of the room his voice emerged, startling her. "It does not. Its soul is tied to mine, and mine is tired." He stepped into the firelight. He looked different than he had that first night. There were faint, dark lines of exhaustion under his eyes that even his immortal perfection could not entirely conceal. The fading of the map was draining him in a way that was now visible. "Then how do I give it back?" she asked, her voice soft. He moved to the table and looked down at her work, at the rows of failed color tests. The original artist did not just paint the map. He wove his own life into it. A piece of his spirit for every river, a memory for every forest. The covenant requires a living sacrifice. Linnea stared at him, horrified. "A sacrifice? You mean blood?" A faint, melancholic smile touched his lips. It was the first time she had seen him almost smile, and it was a deeply sad sight. "Not in the way you think. Not your life force, your emotion. The map does not need pigment. It needs feeling." This was a magic she did not understand, a form of artistry that went beyond any craft she had ever known. He was asking her to paint with her heart. Hesitantly, she picked up her finest brush, the one made from sable hairs. She dipped it into a pool of brilliant green she had mixed for the whisperwood. She closed her eyes, trying to remember the feeling of walking in a forest. The scent of damp earth, the sound of leaves underfoot, the way sunlight filtered through the canopy in shifting patterns. She held on to the feeling, a small, perfect memory of peace. She touched the brush to the map. This time, the color did not sink and die. It bloomed. A luminous, vibrant green spread from the tip of the brush, not like ink on paper, but like moss spreading over a stone in fast motion. It glowed with a soft internal light, pulsing with a life that was breathtaking. Linnea gasped, her eyes flying open. It was alive. The small patch of forest on the map looked real enough to touch. She looked up at Alaric. His eyes were fixed on the glowing spot, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of raw, unguarded hope on his face. He looked at her, and the intensity of his gaze was a physical force. "You see," he whispered, "you are the only one." From that night on, her work transformed. It was no longer a technical process, but an emotional one. To paint the sea of whispers, she had to pour all her memories of loneliness and sorrow into the blue. To restore the sunstone peaks, she had to channel feelings of hope and strength into her yellows and golds. The work was exhausting. Each session left her feeling drained, as if she had given a piece of herself to the paper. But it was also exhilarating. She was not just restoring a map. She was breathing life back into a world. And with every inch of land she resurrected, she could see the change in him. The lines of exhaustion on his face began to fade. The chill in the air around him lessened, replaced by a stillness that felt less like a predator's and more like a deep, abiding calm. The crimson in his eyes, which she now knew appeared when his ancient, primal nature was stirred, was seen less and less. They began to talk, not about the map, but about other things. He would ask her about her childhood, about the mother who had given her the ring. She told him about her quiet life, her love of books, her feeling of being perpetually overlooked. He, in turn, spoke of the past, not his personal past, which remained a closely guarded fortress, but of history. He spoke of kings and empires she had only read about, describing them with the casual intimacy of an eyewitness. He told her what the gardens of Babylon actually smelled like, and the true color of Cleopatra's eyes. He had been there. He had seen it all. His loneliness was a palpable thing, a vast, empty space carved out by the relentless passage of centuries. He had outlived everyone he had ever known, every kingdom, every idea. He was an island in the river of time. One night, as a storm raged outside, battering the high windows of the library with rain, Linnea worked late. She was painting the quiet, winding streams of a place on the map called the Silver Valleys. She poured all her calmest, most peaceful feelings into the work. Her hand, which had been gripping the brush for hours, began to cramp, a sharp, stabbing pain. She cried out softly, dropping the brush and flexing her fingers. Instantly, he was there, moving from the fireside to her table with that silent, inhuman speed that still made her breath catch. "You are hurt," he stated, his dark eyes fixed on her hand. "It is just a cramp," she said, trying to massage the knot out of her palm. "I have been working too long." He hesitated for a long moment. He stood over her, his shadow falling across her work, and she could feel the conflict in him. It was a strange, powerful energy, a battle between his ancient reserve and a new, unfamiliar impulse. Then, slowly, he reached out. His hand, pale and cool, hovered over hers. She looked up at him, her heart suddenly beating faster. "May I?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She could only nod. Very gently, he took her hand in his. The contact was a shock. His skin was not just cool, it was cold, like marble that had been left in the moonlight. But it was not an empty cold. Beneath it, she could feel a thrum of immense contained power, a deep, resonant energy that seemed to hum against her own pulse. He held her hand, his long fingers carefully cradling her palm. He did not rub it or massage it. He simply held it. And a strange warmth began to spread from his cold touch, a deep, penetrating heat that sank into her bones and soothed the aching muscle. It was impossible, a contradiction of nature, but it was happening. She stared at their joined hands, her own, small and stained with ink, held within his, large, pale, and impossibly ancient. The cramp in her hand eased, vanishing completely, but neither of them moved. The moment stretched, suspended in time. The only sounds were the drumming of the rain and the crackle of the fire. She could feel his gaze on her, and she slowly lifted her head to meet his eyes. The library, the storm, the map, it all fell away. There was only the feeling of his cold hand warming hers, and the look in his dark eyes. It was a look of profound, aching tenderness, a look of a man who had not touched another living soul with gentleness in 1,000 years. He had seen her worth. He had honored her heart. And now, in this small, quiet gesture, he was showing her a vulnerability he had likely shown no one. She did not pull her hand away. She simply let him hold it, returning his gaze, her own heart filled with a feeling she did not have a name for. It was not fear. It was not pity. It was a deep, resonant empathy, a connection that transcended the vast chasm of time and nature that separated them. In that moment, she was not just his artisan, and he was not just her patron. They were two lonely souls, finding a moment of quiet solace in a storm. The work on the map continued, but their relationship had subtly, irrevocably shifted. The space between them was no longer filled with a cautious distance, but with a quiet, charged intimacy. He spoke more freely, sharing fragments of his long existence. He told her of watching the great library of Alexandria burn, the helplessness he felt as centuries of knowledge turned to ash. He described the silence of the world before the clangor of industry, when the loudest sound at night was a wolf's howl. Linnea, in turn, found herself opening up in ways she never had before. She spoke of her dreams of creating her own atlas, not of kingdoms and borders, but of forgotten places. A hidden waterfall where the moss grew thick, a field of wildflowers that only bloomed under a full moon, a city street that held the perfect echo. He listened. He truly listened. When she spoke, his attention was absolute, his ancient eyes holding a depth of focus that made her feel as if she were the only person in the world. For a woman who had spent her life being treated as an afterthought, this focused, unwavering attention was a more potent seduction than any poetry or jewels. He saw her, not just her skill, but the soul behind it. He began to show her the secrets of the manor. One evening, he led her not to the library, but to a dusty, forgotten wing of the house. At the end of a long corridor, behind a tapestry depicting a grim, forgotten battle, was a small, iron-bound door. He opened it, revealing a spiral staircase that led up into one of the manor's towers. The room at the top was an observatory. A massive brass telescope pointed towards a ceiling made entirely of glass, now dark and streaked with rain. "I have not been here in 200 years, he said, his voice quiet in the circular chamber. The last person who shared this space with me was an astronomer. He believed the stars were a map of destiny." "And what do you believe?" Linnea asked, running a hand over the cool, smooth brass of the telescope. "I believe they are just distant fires," he replied, his voice tinged with a familiar melancholy. "Beautiful and cold and impossibly far away, much like myself." She turned to look at him. He stood near the entrance, a tall, dark silhouette against the dim light of the corridor. "You are not far away," she said softly. "Not anymore." The truth of her words hung in the air between them. He had been a remote, untouchable legend. But now he was Alaric, the man who listened to her dreams, who warmed her hand, who felt the weariness of 1,000 years. The restoration of the map was nearing its end. Only the heart of the domain remained, the Blackwood itself, and the manor at its center. This was the most critical part, the seat of his power. Linnea knew it would require the most of her. But as Alaric's strength returned, so did the notice of the outside world. His renewed vitality was not something that could be hidden. The crops in his territories grew stronger, the rivers ran clearer, and a sense of prosperity and order began to spread through the land. Such things did not go unnoticed by his rivals. The threat, when it came, started with a familiar name: Mr. Finch. Ruined and disgraced, Finch's bitterness had curdled into a venomous obsession. He found a willing audience in the court of a rival lord, Baron von Hesse, a cruel and ambitious man who had long coveted Alaric's lands. Finch, seeking revenge, told the Baron everything he had guessed about the map and the strange, talented colorist who was now cloistered at Blackwood. He did not understand the true magic of it, but he understood enough. He knew the map was Alaric's weakness, and that Linnea was the key. One night, a deep sense of unease settled over Linnea. The manor was too quiet. Alaric, who had been with her in the library almost constantly, was absent. She felt a prickle of fear, a sense that the fragile peace she had found was about to be shattered. She was working on the final section of the map, her brush poised over the icon of Blackwood Manor itself. She needed to pour her feelings about this place, the fear, the loneliness, the unexpected safety, the burgeoning affection, into this final, critical point. Suddenly, the great library doors burst open. It was not Alaric. It was a group of armed men, their faces grim, led by a sneering Baron von Hesse, and trailing behind them, looking both triumphant and terrified, was Mr. Finch. "There she is!" Finch cried, pointing a trembling finger at Linnea. "The witch who controls the map!" Linnea shot to her feet, her heart seizing with terror. Von Hesse strode forward, his armored boots loud on the stone floor. His eyes, small and cruel, raked over her before landing on the nearly completed map. "Excellent work, Mr. Finch," the Baron sneered. "It seems your information was accurate. Seize her, and bring me the map. We will see how the great Lord Alaric fares when the heart of his kingdom is a pile of ash." Two of his men started towards her. Linnea backed away, her hand instinctively reaching for the heavy pestle she used to grind her pigments. It was a pathetic defense, but it was all she had. But before they could reach her, a blur of motion exploded from the shadows near the fireplace. It was Alaric. He moved with a speed that was not human. One moment he was gone, the next he was a tempest of black cloth and silent fury. He did not use a weapon. He did not need one. He threw one of the Baron's men into a towering shelf of books with the force of a catapult. The entire structure groaned and collapsed, a cascade of leather and paper. The second man let out a strangled cry as Alaric's hand closed around his throat, lifting him clear off the floor. The room erupted into chaos. Von Hesse drew his sword, shouting orders, but his men were terrified. They were facing not a nobleman, but a force of nature, a creature from the darkest legends. The air grew bitingly cold, and the shadows in the room writhed and stretched, coalescing into terrifying, grasping shapes that swirled around the intruder's legs. This was the Vampire King in his full, terrible glory. The crimson in his eyes was not a flicker now. It was a blazing inferno. This was the ancient predator she had first sensed, unleashed. But Linnea was not just a spectator to her own rescue. As von Hesse, momentarily ignored by Alaric, lunged for the map with a dagger, she refused to be sidelined. This was her work, her world. He would not destroy it. Thinking fast, she grabbed a jar of gum arabic, the sticky binder for her inks, and hurled it at the floor in front of him. He slipped, his feet flying out from under him, and crashed heavily to the ground. At the same time, she grabbed her brush, dipped it in the blackest ink, and drew a quick, sharp line on the map, encircling the icon of the library they stood in. She poured all her fear and desperate will to protect into the stroke. The effect was instantaneous and magical. The very shadows Alaric commanded responded to the map. The shadows on the floor around the fallen Baron twisted and solidified, forming thick, writhing tendrils that wrapped around his arms and legs, pinning him to the floor like an insect. He stared in horror as the living darkness held him fast. Linnea looked up from her work, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She met Alaric's blazing eyes across the room. He had dispatched the last of the soldiers and now stood amidst the wreckage, his chest rising and falling heavily. He saw the captured Baron, saw the ink-stained brush in her hand, and a look of fierce, terrible pride crossed his face. She had not hidden behind him. She had stood with him. He turned his attention to the last two intruders. the terrified Mr. Finch, and the struggling Baron von Hesse. "You have made a grave error," Alaric said, his voice a low, deadly promise. "You came into my home. You threatened what is mine." He walked to where Finch was cowering. He did not touch him. He simply leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than any shout. "You took credit for her light, and then you tried to extinguish it. You will live. You will live a long, long life, and you will spend it in obscurity, remembering this night, knowing that the one person you dismissed as nothing was the one person who held the fate of this kingdom in her hands." He turned away from the weeping, broken man and strode to the Baron, still struggling against his shadowy bonds. Alaric knelt beside him, his face a mask of cold fury. "You will be returned to your lands," he said, his voice like chipping ice, "and you will tell them what you saw here tonight. You will tell them that Blackwood is strong, and that its keeper is watchful." He gestured, and the shadows released the Baron, depositing him in a heap on the floor. The surviving men, including a blubbering Finch, scrambled from the room, their terror a palpable stench in the air. The library was a wreck. Books and splintered shelves were everywhere, but the map on its great table was untouched, and it was glowing. With the final stroke she had made, with the raw emotion of the battle, the restoration was complete. The entire map shone with a soft, internal luminescence, every river, mountain, and forest pulsing with vibrant life. Alaric walked slowly back to the table, his inhuman rage receding, leaving behind a deep, quiet stillness. He looked at the map, then at Linnea. The blazing crimson in his eyes softened, returning to their familiar, fathomless dark. "It is done," he said, his voice filled with awe. "Yes," she whispered, her body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. He reached out, not to the map, but to her. He gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, his cool fingers lingering for a moment against her skin. "You did not hide," he said, a note of wonder in his voice. "You fought." "It was my work they were trying to destroy," she said simply. "My world." He looked at her, and the last wall around his ancient, frozen heart seemed to crumble into dust. He had sought a craftsman to save his kingdom. He had found a queen to stand beside him. Weeks later, an invitation went out to every noble house in the territories. Lord Alaric was hosting a grand ball at Blackwood Manor. Attendance was not optional. The whispers were rampant. After years of seclusion, the Lord of Blackwood was re-entering society. Something had changed. Linnea stood before the mirror in her chambers, clad in a gown of deep emerald silk that Elspeth had laid out for her. It was a world away from her ink-stained work dresses. She felt like an imposter. There was a soft knock on the door. It was Alaric. He was dressed in formal black velvet, a stark and stunning figure of nobility, but his eyes were only for her. "You are magnificent," he breathed, his voice filled with a reverence that made her cheeks flush. He held out his arm. "It is time." She took his arm, her small hand resting on the cool velvet of his sleeve. As they walked the long corridors towards the ballroom, the manor felt different. The chill was gone, replaced by a neutral calm. The shadows were just shadows. The house was at peace, just as its master was. When they entered the ballroom, a hush fell over the glittering assembly. All eyes went to them, to the formidable Lord Alaric, and the unknown, plainly dressed woman on his arm. Linnea saw the patrons of Baron von Hesse in the crowd. their faces pale. She even saw Mr. Finch, lurking near the back, a ghost at the feast. Alaric led her to the center of the room. He did not raise his voice, but it carried to every corner with perfect, unnatural clarity. "For a long time," he began, "my house has been in decline. My lands have suffered. Many of you saw this as an opportunity. You saw weakness." His gaze swept the room, cold and sharp, and several nobles flinched. "You were mistaken. My strength was not gone. It was merely waiting. Waiting for the one person with the skill and the spirit to restore it." He turned his gaze upon Linnea, his expression softening into something the crowd had never seen on his face: tenderness, devotion. "This is Mistress Linnea. For years she worked in obscurity, her genius claimed by a lesser man." He glanced towards the back of the room, and Finch physically shrank. "It was her art, her vision, her heart that healed my lands and restored my house. She saw the truth when all others were blind." He lifted her hand. "I named no price for her work, for it is priceless. But I will give her a title worthy of her station." His voice rang with authority. "Before you all, I name her the keeper of the Royal Cartography and protector of the domain. Her word on matters of the land is second only to my own. To disrespect her is to declare yourselves an enemy of Blackwood." Collective gasp went through the room. It was a title of immense, unprecedented power, given to a woman no one had ever heard of. It was a complete reversal of her old life, a public coronation in front of the very people who would have dismissed her as a servant. But he was not finished. He reached into his coat and drew out a small velvet box. "I told you I could not match the worth of what you held most dear," he said, his voice low and for her alone. "I can only protect it." He opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of black silk, was her mother's simple gold ring. But it was changed. It was now held in an impossibly delicate setting of gleaming silver, crafted to look like intertwined branches of willow, protecting the worn gold band without overwhelming it. And next to it was another ring, a band of the same silver, set with a single, flawless obsidian stone that seemed to drink the light, with tiny, almost invisible flecks of crimson deep within it. "The first is your past, which I will always honor," he murmured, taking her mother's ring and sliding it onto the fourth finger of her right hand. "And this," he said, picking up the obsidian ring, "is our future, if you will have it." He held the ring, waiting. He was the vampire king. He commanded shadows and centuries. But in this, he gave her the choice. Tears welled in Linnea's eyes. She looked at the man before her, who had seen her when she was invisible, who had knelt before the value of her heart, and who now offered her a future she had never dared to imagine. She held out her left hand. "I will," she whispered. He slid the ring onto her finger. It was cool against her skin, a perfect fit. He raised her hand to his lips, his touch gentle, a public vow. The onlookers, who had caused her old wounds of dismissal, now stood as silent witnesses to her ultimate triumph. 3 years passed. The world outside knew Linnea as the powerful, enigmatic Lady of Blackwood, the Lord's most trusted counsel. But inside the quiet walls of the manor, she was simply Linnea. She had her own workshop, grander than the library, where she worked on her personal atlas of forgotten places, her masterpiece. Alaric was her constant companion. The love between them was a quiet, deep thing, built not on grand passions, but on shared silence, mutual respect, and a profound understanding that transcended words. He had found his anchor in the river of time, and she had found the one person who saw her completely. One evening, they sat together in the observatory, the glass dome open to a sky brilliant with stars. Linnea, leaning against him, felt the slow, steady, almost imperceptible beat of his ancient heart. She was in her late 20s now, and the first touch of silver was in her hair. He remained unchanged, as ageless as the stone of his home. "The years pass for you," he said softly, his hand gently tracing the line of her jaw. "It is a beautiful, terrible thing to watch." The unspoken question hung between them, the question of her mortality. He would not take her life from her. He would not force an eternity upon her. The choice had to be hers. She turned in his arms, her palm coming to rest on his chest. "When I was a girl," she said, "I was afraid of being forgotten, of living a small life and leaving no mark on the world. You have already given me a legacy that will last for centuries." She looked up into his dark, loving eyes. "My life is not small anymore, but it will be too short if it does not include all the time I can possibly have with you. My choice was made a long time ago, Alaric. My choice is you." A deep, shuddering breath escaped him, the release of a fear he had held for 3 years. He lowered his head, his lips finding the pulse point at the side of her neck, a gesture of infinite tenderness and acceptance. It was not the kiss of a predator, but the kiss of a partner, acknowledging her choice, her gift. He did not bite. Not yet. That would be for another night, a ceremony of their own making. Tonight, it was enough to hold her, to feel her life, warm and steady against his eternal cold, and to know that they would face the endless stars together. For more stories where quiet truth conquers ancient sorrow, and where being overlooked becomes the source of ultimate power, subscribe to Herb Files. So tell me, would you have stayed? Comment where you are listening from tonight. I stay up until my eyes burn to bring you these stories. If this one touched you, do not break my heart. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one.